None of us, I imagine, slept very heavily or continuously that morning, for both the excitement of Lake's discovery and the mountain fury of the wind were against such a thing. So savage was the blast, even where we were, that we could not help but wonder how much worse it was at Lake's camp, directly under the vast, unknown peaks that bred and delivered it. McTighe was awake at 10 o'clock, and I tried to get Lake on the wireless, as agreed, but some electrical condition in the disturbed air and the westward seemed to prevent communication. We did, however, get the Arkham, and Douglas told me that he had likewise been vainly trying to reach Lake. He had not known about the wind, for very little was blowing at McMurdo Sound, despite its persistent rage where we were. Throughout the day we listened anxiously and tried to get Lake at intervals, but invariably without results. About noon, a positive frenzy of wind stampeded out of the west, causing us to fear for the safety of our camp. But it eventually died down, with only moderate relapse at 2 p.m. After 3 o'clock, it was very quiet, and we redoubled our efforts to get Lake, reflecting that he had 4 planes, each provided with an excellent shortwave outfit, and we could not imagine any ordinary accident capable of crippling all his wireless equipment at once. Nevertheless, the stony silence continued, and when we thought of the delirious force of the wind that must have had in his locality, we could not help making the most direful conjectures. By 6 o'clock, our fears had become intense and definite, and after a wireless consultation with Douglas and Thorfinson, I resolved to take steps towards investigation. The 5th aeroplane that we left with McMurdo Sound cache, with Sherman and the 2 sailors, was in good shape and ready for instant use, and it seemed that the very emergency for which it had been saved was now upon us. I got Sherman by wireless and ordered him to join me with the plane and the 2 sailors at the southern base as quickly as possible, the air conditions being apparently highly favourable. We then talked over the personnel of coming investigation party and decided that we would include all hands, together with the sledge and dogs which I had kept with me. Even so great a load would not be too much for one of the huge planes built to essential orders for heavy machinery transportation. At intervals, I still tried to reach Lake with the wireless, but to no purpose. Sherman, with the sailors Gunnarsson and Larson, took off at 7:30 and reported a quiet flight from several points at the wing. They arrived at our base at midnight, and all hands once discussed the next move. It was risky business sailing over the Antarctic in a single aeroplane without any line of bases, but no one drew back from what seemed like the plainest necessity. We turned in at 2 o'clock for a brief rest at some preliminary loading of the plane, but we were up again in 4 hours to finish the loading and the packing. At 7:15 a.m., January 25th, we started flying northwestward under McTighe's pilotage with 10 men, 7 dogs, a sledge, a fuel and food supply, and other items, including the plane's wireless outfit. The atmosphere was clear, fairly quiet, and relatively mild in temperature, and we anticipated very little trouble in reaching the latitude and longitude designated by Lake at the site of his camp. Our apprehensions were over what we might find, or fail to find, at the end of our journey, for silence continued to answer all calls dispatched to the camp. Every incident of that 4.5 hour long flight is burned into my recollection because of its crucial position in my life. It marked my loss at the age of 54. All of that peace and balance which the normal mind possesses through its accustomed conception of external nature and nature's laws. Thenceforward, the 10 of us, but the student Danforth and myself, above all others, were to face a hideously amplified world of lurking horrors which none can erase from our emotions. and which we would refrain from sharing with mankind in general, if we could. The newspapers have printed the bulletins we sent from the moving plane, telling of our non-stop course, our 2 battles with treacherous upper air gales, our glimpse of the broken surface where Lake had sunk his mid-journey shaft 3 days before, but our sight of a group of those strange fluffy snow cylinders noted by Amundsen and Baird as rolling in the wind across endless leagues of frozen plateau. There came a point, though, when our sensations were not to be conveyed in words that the press would understand, and later point that we had to adopt an actual rule of strict censorship. The sailor, Larsen, was first to spy the jagged line of witch-like cones and pinnacles ahead, and his shouts sent everyone to the windows of the great combined plane. Despite our speed, they were very low in gaining prominence, hence we knew they must be indefinitely far off and visible only because of the abnormal height. Little by little, however, they rose grimly into the western sky, allowing us to distinguish various bare, bleak, blackish summits, and to catch the curious sense of fantasy which they inspired as seen in the reddish Antarctic light against the provocative background of iridescent ice dust clouds. In the whole spectacle, there was a persistent, pervasive hint of stupendous secrecy and potential revelation, as if these stark nightmare spires marked the pylons of the frightful gateway into the forbidden spheres of dream and complex gulfs of remote time, space, and ultra-dimensionality. I could not help feeling that they were evil things, mountains of madness whose farther slopes looked out over some accursed ultimate abyss. That seething, half-luminous cloud background held ineffable suggestions of a vague, ethereal beyondness, far more terrestrially spatial, and gave appalling reminders of the utter remoteness, spartanness, desolation, and eon-long death of this untrodden and unfathomed austral world. It was young Danforth who drew notice of the curious regularities of higher mountain skyline, regularities like clinging fragments of perfect cubes which Lake had mentioned in his messages, and which, indeed, justified his own compassion with the dreamlike suggestions of primordial temple ruins on cloudy Asian mountaintops so subtly and strangely painted by Roach. There was indeed something hauntingly Roach-like with this whole unearthly continent of mountainous mystery. I had felt in October when we first caught sight of the Victoria land, and I felt it afresh now. I felt, too, another wave of uneasy consciousness of arcane mythical resemblances, of how disturbingly lethal this land or realm responded to the evilly famed plateau of Lang in the primal writings. Mythologists have placed Lang in Central Asia, but this racial memory of a man, or of his predecessors, is long. And it may well be the certain tales that have come down from the lands and mountains and temples of horror earlier than Asia and earlier than any human world we know. A few daring mystics have hinted at the pre-Pleistocene origin of the fragmentary Nucadic manuscripts and have suggested that the devotees of Thagosha as the alien to mankind as Thagosha itself. Lang, however, in space or time it might brood, was not a region I would care to be anywhere in or near, nor did I relish the proximity of a world that had ever bred such ambiguous and arcane monstrosities as those Lake had mentioned. At the moment, I felt sorry that I had ever read that abhorred Necronomicon, or talked so much with that unpleasantly heterotude folklorist Wilmarth at the university. This mood undoubtedly served to aggravate my reaction to the bizarre mirage which burst upon us from the increasingly opalescent zenith when we drew near the mountains and began to make the cumulative undulations of the foothills. I had seen dozens of polar mirages during the preceding weeks, some of them quite as uncanny and fantastically vivid as the present sample. But this one had a wholly novel and obscure quality to the menacing symbolism, as I shuddered as a seething labyrinth of fabulous walls and towers and minarets zoomed out in troubled ice vapours above our heads. The effect was of a cyclopean city of no architecture known to man or no human imagination, with vast aggregations of night-blackened masonry embodying monstrous perversions of geometrical laws and attaining the most grotesque extremes of sinister bizarrerie. There were truncated cones, sometimes terraced or fluted, surmounted by tall cylindrical shafts that at their bulbously enlarged and often capped with tiers of finished scalloped discs, and strange, beetling table-like constructions, suggesting piles of multitudinous rectangular slabs or circular plates or five-pointed stars, with each one overlapping the one beneath. There were composite cones of pyramids, either alone or surmounting cylinders or cubes, or flatter trunculated cones and pyramids, and occasional needle-like spires and curious clusters of five. All of these febrile structures seemed to knit together by tubular things crossing from one to the other at various dizzying heights, and the impaled scale of the whole was terrifying and the oppressive in its sheer giganticism. The general type of mirage was not unlike some of the wilder forms observed and drawn by the Arctic whaler Scoresby in 1820. But at this time and place, with those dark, unknown mountain peaks soaring stupendously ahead, that anomalous elder world discovery in our minds, and the pall and probable disaster enveloping the greater part of our expedition, we all seemed to find in the taint and latent, malignantly and infuriatingly evil portent. I was glad when the mirage began to break up, though in the process of various nightmare turrets and cones assumed distorted temporary forms of even vaster hideousness. As the whole illusion dissolved to churning opalescence, we began to look earthward again, and saw that our journey end was not far off. The unknown mountains ahead rose dismally up like a fearsome rampant of giants, their curious regularities showing with the startling clearness, even without a field of glass. We were over the lowest foothills now, and we could see amidst the snow, ice, and the bare patches of the main plateau a couple of darkish spots, which we took to be Lake's camp and mooring. The higher foothills shot up between 5 and 6 miles away, forming a range almost distinct from the terrifying line of the more Himalayan peaks beyond them. At length, Ropes, the student who had relieved McTighe at the controls, began to head downward, towards the left-hand dark spot where those marked as the camp. As he did so, McTighe sent out the last uncensored wireless message the world has to receive from our expedition. Everyone, of course, has read the brief and unsatisfying bulletins of the rest of our Arctic sojourn. Some hours after our landing, we sent a guarded report of the tragedy we found, and reluctantly announced the wiping out of the whole Lake party by the frightful wind of the preceding day, or of the night before. 11 known dead, young Gedney missing. People pardoned our hazy lack of details through realization of the shock and the sad event that must have caused us and believe us when we explained the mangling action of which the wind had rendered all 11 bodies unsuitable for transportation outside. Indeed, I flatter myself that even in the midst of our distress, utter bewilderment, and soul-clenching horror, we scarcely went beyond the truth in any specific instance. The tremendous significance lies in what we had dared not tell, and I would not allow but for the need of the warning others off from the nameless terror. It is in fact that the wind had wrought dreadful havoc, Whether all could have lived through it, even without other things, it is gravely open to doubt. The storm, with its fury and madly driven ice particles, must have been beyond anything our expedition had encountered before. One aeroplane shelter, all, it seems, have left it far too flimsy and inadequate state, was nearly pulverized, and the derrick boring was entirely shaken to pieces. The exposed metal of the ground planes and drilling machinery was bruised into high polish, and two of the small tents were flattened despite their snowbanking. Wooden surfaces left out in the blast were pitted and dunded of paint, and signs of tracks in the snow were completely obliterated. It was also true that we found none of the arcane biological objects in the condition to take outside as a whole. We did gather some minerals from the vast trampled pile, including several of the greenish soapstone fragments whose odd five-pointed rounding and faint patterns of grouped dots caused so many doubtful comparisons, and some fossil bones, among which were the most typical of curiously injured specimens. None of the dogs survived, their hurriedly built snow enclosure near the camp being almost wholly destroyed. The wind may have done that, though the greater breakage on the side of the next camp, which was not windward one, suggested an outward leap or break of the frantic beasts themselves. All three sledges were gone, and we tried to explain that the wind may have blown them off into the unknown. The drill and ice melting machinery at the boring were too badly damaged to warrant salvage, so we used them to choke up the subtlety and disturbing gateway to the past which Lake had blasted. We likewise left the camp, the two most shaken up of the planes. Since our surveying party had only 4 real pilots, Sherman, Danforth, McTighe and Ropes in all, with Danforth in a poor nervous shape to navigate. We brought back all the books, scientific equipment and other incidentals we could find, though much of the rather unaccountability blown away. Spare tents and furs were either missing or badly out of condition. It was approximately 4 p.m. after the wide plane cruising had forced us to give Gedney up for lost that we sent our guarded message to the Arkham for relaying, and I think we did well to keep as calm and non-committal as we succeeded in doing. The most we said about the agitation concerning our dogs, whose frantic uneasiness near the biological specimens was to be expected from poor Lake's accounts. We did not mention, I think, their display of the same uneasiness when sniffing around the queer greenish soapstones of certain other objects in the distorted region, objects including scientific instruments, aeroplanes and machinery both at the camp, and of the boring whose parts had been loosened, moved or otherwise tampered with by the winds that must have harboured singular curiosity and investigativeness. About the 14 biological specimens that were pardonably indefinite, we said that the ones we discovered were damaged, but that enough was left of them to provoke Lake's description wholly and impressively accurate. It was hard work keeping our personal emotions out of this matter, and we did not mention the numbers or say exactly how we had found those which we did find. We had, by the time, agreed not to transmit anything suggesting madness on the part of Lake's men. It surely did look like madness to find 6 imperfect monstrosities carefully buried upright in 9-foot-tall snow graves under 5-pointed mounds, punched over with groups of dots and patterns exactly like those in the queer greenish soapstones dug up from the Mesotonic or the Tyrannotree times. The 8 perfect specimens mentioned by Lake seemed to have been completely blown away. We were careful, too, about the public's general peace of mind. Hence Danforth and I said very little of the frightful trip over the mountains the next day. It was that fact that our radically lightened plane could possibly cross the range of such height which mercifully limited the scouting tour to just the 2 of us. On return at 1 a.m, Danforth was close to hysterics, but kept an admirably stiff upper lip. It took no persuasion to make him promise not to show our sketches and the other things we brought away in our pockets, not to say anything more to the others what we had agreed to relay outside, and to hide our camera films for private development later on, so that the part of my present story will be as new to Peabody, McTay, Ropes, Sherman, and the rest as it will be to the world in general. Indeed, Danforth is closer-mouthed than I, for he saw, or thinks he saw, one thing he will not tell even me. As all know, our report included a tale of hard ascent, a confirmation of Lake's opinion of the great peaks of the Archean slate and any other very primal crumple strata, unchanged since at least the middle Comanchean times. Conventional comment on the regularity of the clinging cube and rampart formations. A decision that the cave mouths indicated dissolved calcareous veins, or conjure that certain slopes and passes would permit of the scaling and crossing of the entire range by seasoned mountaineers, and remark that the mysterious other side holds a lofty and immense super-plateau as ancient and unchanging as the mountains themselves. 20,000 feet in elevation, with grotesque rock formations protruding through a thin glacial layer of low, gradual foothills between the general plateau surface and the sheer principles of the highest peaks. This body of data is in every respect true so far as goes, and has completely satisfied the men at the camp. We led our absence of 16 hours, a longer time than our announced flying. Landing, reconnoitering and rock collecting program called for, to a long mythical spell of adverse wind conditions, and told truly of our landing on the farther foothills. Fortunately, our tale sounded realistic and prosaic enough not to tempt any of the others in emulating our flight. Had any tried to do that, I would have used every ounce of my persuasion to stop them, and I do not know what Danforth would have done. While we were gone, Peabody, Sherman, Ropes, and McTay, and Williamson had worked like beavers over Lake's two best planes, fitting them again for use despite the altogether unaccountable judging of their operative mechanisms. We decided to load the planes the next morning and start back for our old base as soon as possible, even though, indirect, that was the safest way to work towards McMurdo Sound, for a straight line flight across the most utterly unknown stretches of eon-dead continent would involve many additional hazards. Further explanation was hardly feasible in a view of our tragic decimation and the ruin of our drilling machinery, and the doubts and the horrors around us, which we did not reveal, made us wish only to escape from the austral world of desolation and brooding madness as swiftly as we could. As the public knows, our return to the world was accomplished without further disasters. All planes reached the old base on the evening of the next day, January 27th, after a swift, non-stop flight, and on the 28th, we made McMurdo Sound in 2 laps, one pausing briefly and occasionally by faltry rudder in the various wind over the ice shelf after we had cleared the Great Plateau. In 5 days more, the Arkham and Miskatonic, with the hands of the equipped on board, were shaken clear of the thickening ice and working up Ross Sea with mockery mountains of Victoria Landing looming westward against the troubled Antarctic sky, and twisting the wind's wheels into wide-range musical piping which chilled my soul to the quick. Less than a fortnight later, we left the last hint of the polar land behind us, and thanked heaven that we were clear of the haunted, accursed realm where life and death, space and time have made black blasphemous alliances in the unknown epochs since matter first wreathed and swam in the planet's scarce cooled crust. Since our return, we have all constantly worked to discourage Antarctic expeditions, and have kept certain doubts and guesses to ourselves with splendid unity and faithfulness. Even young Danforth, with his nervous breakdown, has not flinched or babbled to his doctors. Indeed, as I have said, there is one thing that he alone thinks he saw, which he will not tell even me. I think it would help him in his psychological state if he would consent to do so. It may explain and relieve much, though perhaps the thing was no more than a delusive aftermath of the earlier shock. That's the impression I gather after those rare, irresponsible moments when he whispers disjointed things to me. Things he repudiates mentally as soon as he gets a grip of himself again. It would be hard work deterring others from the Great White South, and some of our efforts may be directly harm our cause by drawing inquiry notice. We might have known from the first that human curiosity is undying, and that the results we announced would be enough to spur others ahead of the some age-long pursuit of the unknown. Lake's reports of those biological monstrosities had aroused naturalists and paleontologists to the highest pitch, though we were sensible enough not to show our detached parts that we had taken from the actual buried specimens, or our photographs of those specimens that we were found. We also refrained from showing the more puzzling of the sacred bones and greenish soapstones, while Danforth and I have closely guarded the pictures we took or drew on the super plateau across the range. Crumpled things we smoothed, studied in terror, and brought away in our pockets. But now the Starkweather Moor party is organising, and with thoughtfulness far beyond anything our outfit attempted. If not to dissuade, they will get into the innermost nucleus of the Antarctic and melt and bore till they bring up that which may end the world as we know. So I must break through all reticencies at last, even about that ultimate nameless thing beyond the mountains of madness.